So from an employment perspective, effectively there that employees can get into trouble if they say things which are damaging to their employer, even when said outside of work. The legal principles here are no different than they have been for many decades. The problem now is that with Twitter and Facebook and increased use of such sites, we're getting much more recorded material down on paper effectively. We've seen many examples of recent cases where social media has come back to haunt the writer. For example, the recent serious case of the #BloodyCyclist, where the employee in question was let go for her remarks after she knocked over a cyclist and then boasted about it on Twitter.
And where do people stand legally on Twitter comments that are posted?
So generally what people do on Twitter, as with what they do in their own time, is none of an employer's business, assuming they're not tweeting for business purposes. After all, people have a right to privacy and freedom of expression. But for example, we've seen that this is not necessarily always the case. So in a recent case of Smith and Trafford Housing Trust, a Christian commented on Facebook that the proposals for gay marriage were effectively an equality gone too far. A colleague took offence to this and reported him to the employer, who then dismissed him for gross misconduct. This was held to be unfair, and the basic principles were it wasn't work-related, his view was widely held and not necessarily derogatory on his part, and it was clearly a personal view that he held. But staff's rights are not really unqualified in this respect, and we're seeing many more examples coming through of where staff have just taken this a little bit too far. So a prime example is something that's coming up on your screen right now.
Okay, so what are the rights of employers to look at staff's profiles on social media, for example?
So if someone posts content onto the web which is unprotected by passwords and they're putting it into the public domain, then they cannot complain if their employer or someone else, for that matter, looks at it. If password protected content is displayed, then unless the employer has a good reason or they've got your consent, generally they shouldn't be accessing it. The problem is that when you think something's private, it might not necessarily be the case, and we're seeing many more examples where people post comments on Facebook, for example. A friend sees the post and happens to be an ex-colleague, they print it off and pass it to the employer, all of a sudden this becomes public. Some US states have legislated to provide protection to employees around their use of social media, although the extent of such protection is still not entirely clear. So for example, Congress recently blocked a prospective ban on UK bosses from asking employees to hand over their Facebook passwords as a condition of their employment, so quite controversial stuff. In the UK, we have no specific employment laws dealing with social media in mind, but they are the basic principles that exist.
And what are the comebacks people face from Twitter?
So there are many different comebacks that can come about as a result of people's tweets and other posts on social media. One clear example is embarrassment to the employee in question, but also potentially to other work colleagues. Disciplinary proceedings could follow if something is derogatory to another colleague or to the employer, and that could result in losing your job. Finally, there is obviously the element of whatever you record on social media will remain there forever, and a prospective employer might then be able to look at that going forward.
So what should employers think about to protect themselves and their staff from social media?
So we would strongly advise employers to have a good social media policy in place which sets out what is and is not acceptable. And for example, companies might insist on individuals' posts being expressly personal. It's important to educate staff on what is and is not accepted and what you would expect them to do in these situations. And it might be appropriate, depending on the workplace and the work ethos, to consider restricting staff's abilities to access certain social media sites such as Facebook if they're not needed for business purposes, for example.
Finally, what should staff think about when using social media?
So it's very important that staff think twice when recording anything on social media. The basic rule of thumb is if you wouldn't say it to someone face to face, for whatever reason, then don't record it on any social media form, regardless of whatever you think your privacy settings are or indeed how restricted your connections are.